Well, good afternoon and hello, Central Virginia. It's terrific that everybody is joining, and I know more will. Typically, this is the time that I am usually out visiting in your hometown, so it would be much better to be in person, but I am so glad that you're all joining. I'm Liz Schreier. I am the President and CEO of the U.S. Global Leadership Coalition, and I want to begin by hoping that all of you are healthy and safe, and certainly send my thoughts to anybody who has suffered health-wise or economically during this very difficult season. But I am so pleased that you are joining us for what I know is going to be a really important discussion to talk about America's role in the world in the midst of COVID-19, and to really dig down a little deeper of why leading globally matters locally. And certainly I can't think of any more obvious prism to look at than what's happening with this deadly disease. How lucky we are to be able to have an opportunity to have a virtual town hall meeting with somebody you know well, a very wonderful new friend of the USGLC, and that's, of course, your Congresswoman, Abigail Spanberger, who you're going to see. I'm going to introduce formally in a moment, but she is in the Zoom room, so I'm going to give a shout out and say hello to her. Let me do a few quick logistics. All of you are on mute, only so we don't get some background noise, but I'm going to introduce and let you talk in just a little bit so that you can ask questions and be part of this discussion. There's a couple of ways you're going to be able to ask questions. I'll repeat it in a moment, but just in case you're not as familiar with this platform, there is a participant button, either if you're on by computer down at the bottom, if you're by iPad, probably up at top, or by phone, you'll find it. You click on that and you can raise your hand. If you're calling in by phone, you hit *9. And that's how you'll be able to raise your hand. Or there's a Q&A and you can write your question in the chat box. So as we're going along, that's how you can do it. I'm just going to say a few words to kind of set the scene and then bring in our special guest. It's hard to believe, but USGLC is 25 years old this year. And boy, the world has changed. I'm going to show you a few slides so you can get a flavor of what we're talking about. So think about where the world was 25 years ago. The Cold War was over, and some of our fellow citizens actually thought, we won, we could get a peace dividend, we could withdraw from the world. So they were thinking, we don't need the State Department, we don't need USAID, we can withdraw from the Peace Corps. And there were a bunch of us that said, that's really dangerous. We should not do that. We need to be engaged in the world. So we started to organize, and that organization from 25 years ago is actually the host of this meeting for the handful of you who are new to us. That is the USGLC. We are the Big Tent, or what a lot of people call the Strange Bedfellow Coalition. So you're looking at just a bunch of icons of different organizations. There are actually 500 businesses and NGOs that are part of the coalition that's hosting this conversation today. We are also really proud that we are bipartisan. We are, our advisory committee is kind of the who's who of national security and foreign policy. Every former living Secretary of State chaired by Colin Powell. And we're proud to have over 200 retired 3- and 4-star military leaders and admirals that join us, as well as live in every state, proudly, of course, in the state of Virginia. And what brings us together is what exactly we're going to talk about today with Congresswoman Spanberger. We believe deeply that America needs to lead in the world, not only because it's the smart thing to do, right thing to do, but it's the smart thing to do because it matters to our economics, our security, and our values. And again, the prism we're going to look at today is through the lens of COVID-19. And we see it's a stark reminder of why we need to invest in global health, why we need to invest in diplomacy, invest in our development. So what do we do is the last thing, is what we do is actually what we're going to do today. We talk about it. We advocate about it. We advocate for this little 1% of the federal budget. It's known as the international affairs budget, but some people think it's the foreign aid budget. It's really much more than that. It is the folks that go out and they fight in the Ebola response in West Africa, so we make sure it didn't come across our shores back here. It helps invest in making sure that we beef up weak and fragile health systems, emerging markets and programs for our goods and services, our diplomats. And then we have forums like we're going to do today to talk about how these all matter and impact us here at home. So today's conversation is going to take all of these issues, but look at it through the prism of what's happening in the current environment around COVID-19. Because as we're going to talk about, as long as this virus is anywhere, Americans are at risk. We could get everything right and have nobody in this country have COVID-19, which wouldn't that be wonderful? Probably isn't going to happen. And as soon as we have one plane go overseas, it'll come right back here. So there's a humanitarian toll of what's going on around the world, but it also has a direct impact on our own interests. So let's get into the discussion, and let me introduce our wonderful guest of honor. You know her well. She is your Congresswoman Abigail Spanberger, representing the 7th District of Virginia, who from day one of this deadly disease landing on our shores have been out there fighting for the safety of her constituents. She may be a freshman, but she is no stranger to the issues of national security and foreign policy, having been a public servant working in the CIA for so many years. She has traveled the globe and seen firsthand how America's global leadership makes a difference for our national interests. And I can tell you she has used her skills masterfully in terms of when she got to Congress, serving on the House Foreign Affairs Committee, particularly in the subcommittee in Asia. USGLC is so proud to have worked with her and seeing how she has used her powerful voice to enhance our mission, which, as you can see, building a better, safer world every day since she's been in Congress, fighting for the role of diplomats, the importance of global development. And I can tell you that I have watched, because whichever side of the aisle one is, her colleagues listen to her and look to her for guidance. So Congresswoman, please join us. It's an honor to learn from you and learn with you today. And your constituents now can see you. And the first thing I would ask is, how are you and how's your family during this really challenging time?
Thank you for asking. I'm doing okay. I'm doing fine. My family's doing fine. I have 3 children who, like so many on the call, who have school-age children. They're at home. We're trying to adapt, keep them updated. Lots of Zoom meetings with classes, but we're doing just fine. We're doing just fine. But, you know, I have many constituents, small business owners, individuals who have lost their job, those who are facing food insecurity again or for the first time, who are not doing fine. And I'm grateful for the opportunity to be able to serve at this time in history. It is both a challenge and I think it presents a real ability for us as Americans to join together in this fight against this virus and to look towards the way that we intend to rebuild our communities and our economy, and some of the real weaknesses that have been demonstrated and illuminated because of this virus and this pandemic.
Well, I know that you're going to kick this off by sharing a few remarks. So before we get into the Q&A, I'm going to pass it back to you, and we look forward to some opening thoughts, and then we'll get into the question. Back to you.
Perfect. Thank you very much. And thank you, Liz, as always. I'd like to thank the U.S. Global Leadership Coalition for arranging this opportunity for me to speak directly to Virginians about how U.S. global leadership and how we think about our role in the world and our own national security does impact our preparedness for and our reactions to crises like COVID-19. And I'd like to begin by saying thank you to all the Virginians who are involved with this organization. I remember before I was ever elected, having a meeting at a local coffee shop with a couple folks from Central Virginia to talk about this organization and their commitment to its work. We had a local rabbi, and we had a military veteran and other community members who wanted to share with me the good work that this organization does. And ever since I first became aware because of their advocacy, I have been just impressed by the scope of USGLC's engagement and its work, both on Capitol Hill and throughout our communities across the country. And to start this conversation, I want to just make very clear that U.S. leadership in the global response to COVID-19 is essential to our national security. I serve on the Asia subcommittee of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, and our subcommittee first held a hearing on the coronavirus outbreak and what we were seeing in China in early February 5th. We had a second one later that month. And what we heard during these initial hearings from public health experts and from administration officials reaffirmed something that we already knew. The United States, or I would argue, many within Congress already knew, the United States needs to demonstrate and needed to demonstrate leadership in the international response in order to keep Americans safe at home. Since these hearings back in February, COVID-19 has ravaged families and communities in the United States and around the world, including right at home in Central Virginia. The death toll, as well as the impact on our way of life, has been heartbreaking and hard for so many people. And as we do everything we can to halt the spread and the impact of the virus in our local communities and around the country, we must also recognize that US leadership in the global fight against coronavirus is a crucial part of ending the suffering we're seeing here at home. The COVID-19 pandemic has demonstrated that infectious disease know no border, and an outbreak in a remote village can spread to major cities across populated continents and back home in the United States in just a few hours or days. Even once we have more testing throughout the United States, even as we begin to see dropping numbers of cases, severe outbreaks of this disease could easily reappear. And no matter how successful we are in fighting the threat of COVID-19 at home, as Liz said, we will not end the suffering and the fear created by this virus until we also are combating it around the world. This is exactly why global health experts, as well as foreign policy and military leaders like those at Global Leadership Coalition, are speaking out. Many are calling on the administration to lead by example and to demonstrate leadership on the global stage, because as our nation cedes international leadership, we are demoting our international standing. We are creating a void that our adversaries will fill and exploit. And critically, we are risking the lives and the safety of Americans back at home. So before I finish my opening remarks, I'd like to add one more piece to my thinking on this subject. This pandemic is a very painful reminder that at the end of the day, US national security comes down to our resilience at home. And as we face international threats, including infectious disease, we are only as strong and as prepared as our most vulnerable neighbors and our most susceptible systems. And the coronavirus pandemic highlights that national security preparedness is about much more than our military and our intelligence structures. National security preparedness is about our medical supply chains, our healthcare system, our technology infrastructure, the safety of American workers, the strength of our public education system, our food supply chain, and so much more. And our national security threats extend well beyond the kinetic wars we fight and the threat of terrorism that dominates so much of our thinking in this space. As we've seen with COVID-19, it's so much more than that. It's climate change, it's the availability of water, it's mass migration, it's the availability of an education, or the strength and resilience that a community has against ideologies that might further tear them apart. And going forward, we must be prepared for the full range of risks to American security. And to achieve the necessary level of preparedness, we must think of national security in a far more comprehensive and integrated fashion. We need to recognize it's rooted in our strength at home, and that the United States must lead on the global stage to provide a sense of security so that Americans, as we're facing challenges at home, we know that we are doing everything we can to address those challenges abroad as well. And as we strengthen and implement our response to the COVID-19 pandemic and prepare for future threats, we must recognize that US global leadership is essential to protecting the health, the security, the economic interests of all Americans. And we cannot step back from this challenge. We must respect our place in the world and show leadership at a time like this when it is so incredibly necessary, because it's important. It's important on all levels, and it is, most important here at home. So thank you for inviting me to participate in this event today. Thank you to everyone who is participating, and I look forward to joining the conversation.
That was terrific, powerful words, and a great kickoff for our discussion. So here's what we're going to do. I'm going to ask a few opening questions, and then we'll involve everybody else. But thank you for setting the stage for what will become a terrific conversation. So I think what I'd love to do is, if I can, my opening question, actually I'm going to play a really short video, and I want to ask you a question on the other side of it. So, Matt, if you can play the first opening video, we'll ask you a question. I think you'll understand why.
Today, the greatest risk of global catastrophe doesn't look like this. Instead, it looks like this. If anything kills over 10 million people in the next few decades, it's most likely to be a highly infectious virus rather than a war. Not missiles, but microbes. Now, part of the reason for this is that we have invested a huge amount in nuclear deterrence, but we've actually invested very little in a system to stop an epidemic. We're not ready for the next epidemic.
So that's been all over social media now, but it actually is a TED Talk from 2015. That is Bill Gates' TED Talk from 5 years ago.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, not enough listened. But he's singing off a song sheet you said long ago. And we know we're not ready because CDC tells us that 70% of the world's health system are not able to detect, to respond, or to prevent a pandemic. So, Congresswoman, we just heard your incredible opening remarks. Without pointing blame, because the we are not ready is, the greater we. How do we get here? Why do we not have the political will to have invested in what Bill Gates was saying 5 years ago? Where did we kind of get this wrong? Again, the greater we.
Yeah, well, I think there's a large element. I've thought a lot about this because it impacts how I talk to people about this. Because I am, by my background with CIA, you're always planning for the worst case scenario. You're always imagining what's the most catastrophically terrible thing that could possibly happen, which is not necessarily a good way to think all the time, but it is helpful when you are looking at national security threats. And I think we face two major challenges in this space. One is we have been successful in the past. And so it becomes almost a challenge to continue ringing the bell of alarm that it could be worse next time. When we had the bird flu, right, avian flu, there was a run on Tamiflu. It was potentially going to be catastrophic, but we were able to really get in front of it before it reached the levels of COVID-19. Now, and of course, there are differences between different types of viruses in terms of their level of contagiousness. So I'm not comparing apples to apples, but we did have the same sort of emergent concern, in the media, in discussions that we had back in January, February. Then we had swine flu, similar thing. Then we had Ebola, which was, visually far more horrific in many ways because of the type of disease it was. And each time we got ready, and then it didn't come to us in the way that could have been the worst case scenario. And so I think there's an element where, because of prior successes, or even just differences between types of viruses, a little bit of that urgency left us. And I say us in the global sense. And I think that most recently with Ebola, we were so aggressive as a country in taking the fight to Africa and taking the fight to Ebola, that I think lost in that conversation was, yes, we are, from a humanitarian and a public health standpoint, going to Africa to help. We are bringing tremendous resources in terms of medical professionals and military personnel to fight there. But we're fighting there so that it doesn't come to us. Frankly, it's the same discussion that we have when it comes to terrorism. And so I think there's one element where, because of some of the successes that we've had, the level of urgency and perhaps the fear that existed might have made it so that, once again, when the conversation started getting concerned, we had a little bit, oh, well, we've been here before and it never got that bad element. Right. I think that's one piece of it. I think the other piece is that we have stepped away in recent years from a position of global leadership. And as you mentioned, since the end of the Cold War, we've been doing that bit by bit by bit. But particularly just within the past couple of years, we ended the USAID Predict program, which is literally meant to predict where there might be global pandemics taking blood tests from bats to see what viruses they might carry. We removed a physician who was based on the ground in China, in Wuhan, because it no longer seemed necessary. We continue to debate funding to State Department and to State Department, to USAID, to the preventative measures that exist in global health, and frankly, that exist as it contends with economic instability or terrorist issues or other transnational challenges. We have in recent years invested far less in preventative measures than we have prioritized sort of the reaction to those things. So I think those are the two major pillars that have put us in the position that we find ourselves today.
So let's look at going forward. So one of the things that we've been doing with a lot of people that are part of this conversation is making the case as to why investing is part of the domestic response. So a question actually for the audience, there is something down on your screen that says, here's a poll. And I want to see how well you know your fellow Americans, and then we'll come back to a question for the congressman. So we actually polled the American public to see what are your attitudes about engagement in the world? And so this is a question for the audience. What percentage of voters believe that we won't be safe at home as long as COVID-19 is still spreading abroad? Do you think it's 15% of Americans, 35%, 50%, 77%? So click on what you think. What do you think the percentage of voters believe this? Take a minute. And let's see, what do you think? So they think 77%, and that's correct. So almost 80% of Americans get this. They get we need to engage with the rest of the world. And so here's my question, Congresswoman, is Congress, as you know well, is now debating the next supplemental. You just had a vote in the House of Representatives to that you actually voted against the package, probably for lots of reasons. One of the pieces is in a $3 trillion bill, there was zero for this international response. Now, I know this is the beginning of the process. Question for you. Do you think at the end of the day, when there is a bipartisan deal, which there will be at some point, do you think there'll be an international response? American public, we just showed you, and your constituents believe that they think there should be. Do you think there will be?
Yes, but I don't think it's the one that should have been the case. I mean, I think that our engagement, and this is, you have to do an after action report so that you get it right next time. I think that where we should have done better would have been by engaging very, very early. When there were reports out of China, we should have aggressively followed the reports. And we had intel coming in November, December related to this, some public reporting at that time. COVID-19 is called COVID-19 because it was first documented in 2019. And so I think that looking back as a way to inform future actions, we need to be aggressively involved at the beginning. To answer your question about now and moving forward, we have record unemployment in this country. Just over the weekend, I was at a food distribution point in Culpeper, the northern portion of the district I represent. I heard the numbers were about 400 cars came through in a relatively smaller sized county. The impact right now, as we continue to see Americans across the country dying, as we continue to see our counties and localities facing tremendous instability, as our small businesses remain shuttered, I think at this point we are still in stop the bleeding mode. So I think in the next package, and I did vote against the last package for a couple reasons, well, for many reasons, one of which is it accepts that mass unemployment is the state of play and doesn't actually do anything to get people back at work. And so looking at some of the weaknesses that exist in our country in terms of the healthcare challenges, the financial instability, food insecurity, where we need to work to address the issue of mass unemployment as a direct reaction to COVID-19. So we're talking about immediate reaction. I think we're still in stop the bleeding mode as it relates to our country and our instability, particularly in the economic space, for individuals, businesses, and our localities and county governments, state governments as well. but then we look at what comes next. And that, I believe, is a place where we need to make substantial investments in how we grow out of this crisis. And some of that's at home. I have been a major advocate for broadband internet technology and major investment. I brought together more than 70 members of Congress, Democrats and Republicans, to say, as we are growing out and building out of this crisis, this is an infrastructure shortcoming that has hurt us in this crisis, and we must make this investment. I think at the investment time frame is where we will see longer range thinking, or I should say where we should see longer term thinking about how we get engaged internationally in that next step of prevention, preventing the next iteration of COVID, preventing the next outbreak. But if we were to also, so the immediacy, the future term, there's a lot of international work. We just saw international leaders join together, I believe it was last week, my weeks are running together, to demonstrate their commitment to fighting COVID-19, and we weren't there. And so that, while Congress can push and say, okay, we're gonna do this to stop the bleeding at home, then we want to see these levels of investment overseas, either related to COVID or just in our regular, foreign affairs related budget. We can't control being there. And the decision of this administration to walk away from that global stage, it isn't punitive towards the others who show up. It is hurting ourselves, because when we walk away, somebody else takes our spot. When we walk away from that level of influence and engagement, somebody else will backfill it. And we are creating the space. I mean, there's been a lot of adversarial talk towards China. We are creating a space where China gets to come in. I was talking with a foreign leader recently who said, when we're not there, they get to come in like Mother Teresa. It's a little bit of a sassy comment, but that is how major foreign leaders and diplomats are viewing our absence. We are creating a space for other countries, in this case China, to come in and establish themselves in a space that we have previously been privileged to hold, and recognize that our engagement in the international space, it is about our own priorities. It is about being a voice for the values that we try to live here at home and that we want to see strengthened across the world. And if we're not there with that voice, then who is?
So let me ask you 3 quick risks if we don't play. And the first one is one you know really well, you've already touched upon it, but it's national security. So there's growing concerns I've been hearing from a lot, you have too, about the increase about fragility abroad. In the last month alone, extremist attacks in sub-Saharan Africa have increased by 37%. The Pentagon is talking about a surge of ISIS in Syria alone. The warning signs are everywhere. So put your old CIA hat, your intel that you're getting from Congress. How worried are you about the destabilization going on in especially states of fragility and conflict?
I'm tremendously concerned about this. And I'll give a basic example. Sometimes people wonder why it is that Hezbollah has so much power in Lebanon. And it's as simple as who brings the water, right? In certain countries where there is not an infrastructure, a government infrastructure like we're used to, it's who brings you water, who can provide for your most basic needs, be it the water, be it security for your family. And so when we are in this place of greater instability, and we feel it here at home with people losing their jobs and people not able to put food on the table, and people concerned about their loved ones who either have died or may get sick, you start to get far more basic in what requirements to survive you feel are necessary. And in the counterterrorism space, we have previously seen it when a major natural weather event occurs. That's a place where terrorists and those who would push a terrorist ideology seize on that moment, because there's fragility. There are the government structures, the usual structures that may never have been as strong as what we would expect in other places in the world, are absolutely decimated, and you can't fight back. And so it becomes a question of well, if they're bringing me water, maybe they're not that bad. And either in allowing for ideology to spread, that's a major risk. And then we just see the overall violence because our attention and our ability to fight it is different. The attack on the maternity ward in Afghanistan, is a horrific and horrifying example of the way that groups can just be more brazen when they know that we are, we as in the global sense, when people are distracted or focused on just stabilizing things in a way that, traditionally is not of the same urgent level.
The second risk you talked about, but is the economy. We're seeing not only not the 36 million of unemployed, which is probably an underestimated number. We're seeing the IMF talk about an economic global loss of $9 trillion in the GDP. Obviously, Virginia is a state that totally understands international trade, and particularly with emerging markets. And we're seeing a collapse of in lots of places, but in the developing world, it's just crumbling. Real quick in terms of how do you worry about the economic trade when the fastest growing markets before COVID-19 were in the developing world?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's causing us to reassess everything. I don't know what our trading partners, either those who buy our goods or those who send us goods, what those are going to look like in the coming weeks, let alone months or even years. Markets that have long been the focus of domestic attention for us to build markets for American products. If the demand is decimated because of this crisis, that has a lot of impact here at home for small business owners, or particularly our producers and growers. And to be able to provide for that and adjust for that, I mean, this comes to the contingency planning. We don't know how bad it's going to get. And then on the larger economic scale, the threat of what it means for the average American consumer to not necessarily feel comfortable spending money because they're so financially impacted by this crisis, or if they're less financially impacted, not having the ability to do so. There are weak spots that we are creating just within our own local communities because of the public health priority of shutting down and staying at home, that the demand here for some of those products that might have been imported, and some of the fruits and vegetables that might have been imported, it's a little bit of a less in demand for XYZ item, but back in Brazil or back in insert any other country that needs to send their items to the United States, what does that mean long term for the economic fallout that exists there, and what does that mean for the stability of the government, the stability of their economy, and I think we have to look at those weak spots, because we should be seeing them as international relations related challenges for years, if not decades into the future.
Impressive with the depth that you can tour the world. Last question for me, and then I want to open it up to everybody, is one also clearly, because you serve on the House Foreign Affairs Committee and you also serve on the Agricultural Committee. And that's, at the end of the day, this is a humanitarian crisis. The head of the World Food Program, David Beasley, has called this not just a health pandemic, but a hunger pandemic of biblical proportion, screaming out a clarion call that we are seeing famines, not just a famine, but famines of biblical proportion. Comment about your concern about what you're seeing on that scale of concern about the food insecurity around the world.
So if we look at what's happening here at home, the demand for support for nutritional assistance has gone up. Just the basic example of where I was over the weekend in one of the counties that I represent, I believe the final total was about 400 cars came through, and some cars had multiple representatives from a couple different families. So, estimated more than 400 families need support in in being able to feed themselves or others. You know, and this is, that's one piece of it, right? An example right here on the ground where all of a sudden, and the volunteers, this is a typical event. They frequently, it's an organization, a lovely organization that does food distribution events. And typically they do it in a church and people walk in and they have a little bit of a conversation and they give them food. Well, they've moved it to a major sports complex parking lot where they have individuals who are volunteering to direct traffic because they tried it at the church, and even in a drive-through venue, they were backing up the parking lot and it couldn't work. So, you know, using that as an example of what happens in a place where, of course, food insecurity existed beforehand in some pockets and in some places, but where it's exploded, thinking about what that means on the global level. If you are looking at regions of the country or the world where there was already food insecurity, where they already had severe weather patterns that could absolutely wipe out an entire season of growth, what that meant locally. And now you have the same people who might be planting and picking and harvesting and selling and delivering, you know, here at home, but then overseas, they might be sick, loss of wages, inability to move basic food products from one place to whatever the market is, market closures. If you think about the local example of how much the need has exploded and how we've had to react in such a challenging way, think about a country that is significantly less developed, a country that, you know, within all of our lifetimes have suffered 1 or 2 famines. The risk there is just profound. And then we look at the challenges to, you know, food supply here in the United States, where we've seen tremendous outbreaks of the virus in meat packing plants and what that's meant for a threat to the US meat supply. You know, there's some larger economic issues at play and at concern with, you know, what is the challenge of our supply chain that one virus can knock out a couple plants and potentially put, you know, such pressure on the food supply here. But again, in a country like the United States, if we're threatened by that, the risk globally is just so I don't have a word for it.
Right, there isn't one. It isn't one. Well, let me bring in one of your constituents to just add a few words and ask the first question from the participants, and that is the president. It's the first person who introduced me to you. It's the president and CEO of Child Fund International, who Ann Goddard, a former member of the board of USGLC. Ann, you get the first comment and question, and then I'm going to open it up to everybody.
Thanks, Liz, and thanks, Congresswoman, for joining us today. I have so many thoughts in my head. I was in Africa the first time as a volunteer 40 years ago. Liz mentioned Peace Corps, and I lived through a major famine, the Ethiopian famine that spread over the borders. And I knew, I have images in my head of what that looked like. When I was talking to, I remember going around, I was working on a health project and we had to take 24-hour diet recall. What did you eat in the last 24 hours? And I remember several people responding, tea. I took bark off the tree and I brewed my tea. And that's the only thing I had for 24 hours. People have said recently, for the average African, the food they eat, they buy every day because they've earned the money that day, because they're working in day labor kind of jobs. And those have gone immediately once people had to be curtailed. Child Fund saw that. Child Fund has a long history of working in these places. As you know, we've been around 80 years. As I like to say, hope comes from a place in Virginia called Richmond to millions of people around the world. So we launched our biggest ever response effort. Our goal is to reach 6.3 million children and family members, raising $56 million. We're on our way to do that. I think we will. The response from Americans have been very positive, from our other corporations, et cetera. I'm gonna talk about what Liz said though, hunger. We saw right away that hunger is gonna be the biggest problem here for Africa and many of the developing world. It's not gonna be deaths from the disease, it's gonna be deaths from hunger. And David Beasley did say about this severe hunger, he estimates 135 more million people will be in severe hunger. He says 3 waves are affecting that. One is the refugee. We all know there was a huge refugee influx before the pandemic, to the pandemic. 3, you mentioned it slightly, Congresswoman, the locust infestation that's happening in East Africa now, which is incredible, wiping out crops. But a lot of people say a fourth wave is affecting this, and it's going to be the inward turning of so many countries around the world because of all the problems we have ourselves. I don't think the average American, look at list statistics, feels that way. We still have tens of thousands of supporters in Virginia and hundreds of thousands across the US that are still sending their $500 a year that they do us. But I am concerned that leadership at the top, if our Congress, if without putting any money in that bill for international assistance, if our leaders aren't saying we should be helping others, that the empathy might dry up in the average American. So Congresswoman, do you share that concern? And how can we start messaging it different at the top, even from Congress and all leaders, to say our role is also outside. It's not just here at home. Though we are hungry, yes, our food is not, we're not getting all the food we need for a lot of families. It's not drinking tea
Great.
from bark from a tree.
Yeah. So, Anne, it's so good to see you. And I'm continue to be impressed by all the tremendous work that you do. And I'm delighted that your organization is based in our district. It is a point of pride for me in particular, because I serve on the Foreign Affairs Committee. I think that the risk of turning inward is a significant one. And I think that in order to fight it, we have to be creative in the way that we talk about the risks. And I think there are many Americans who the notion that a child anywhere in the world would be impacted or hungry or a family would go without is inspiring enough for them to support organizations like Child Fund. And taking it one step further, I think, is broadening that conversation to those who might not be triggered by that immediate sense of that family is like mine, but on the other side of the world, and I want to help them. I think for those who might need a step beyond that, it has to be, I think we need to broaden the conversation to talk about why it matters. And I think we can make some discussions focused back to Ebola, where with Ebola, when we were able to stop Ebola, which stopping Ebola meant saving lives in a far off place, right? But when we were able to save lives in a far off place and contain that virus, we also were protecting Americans. We were doing good by others and we were protecting ourselves. And so I think that for many, it is a reminder, and particularly during a time when people are afraid, when you're afraid, sometimes the global perspective, because you're focused on your own survival and your family's own survival, reminding people of the need and drawing on that empathy, I think is the first step. But if that's not an immediate trigger, and let's say, for some of my colleagues on Capitol Hill, then having the conversation of, if it isn't about helping people, if it's not as simple as that for us or for you, let's talk about why this matters. Because containing famine in a particular place, getting at that root cause of economic and political instability, means avoiding a generation potentially of those who might be vulnerable to exploitation and extremist ideology that does impact us. And that helping a community be just a bit more stable is part of ensuring a better, stronger, more stable world for our own children. And I think sometimes making that connection and the investment and the investment in prevention is so much greater in its value than the cost of being reactive later down the line, and recognizing that there is a trajectory towards potential famine in many areas around the world, and figuring out how can we invest in the systems right now that can either thwart that completely or pull back from the severity we will see. Eventually we will respond because that's who we are as a nation, but it is actually beneficial to us and beneficial to them if we do it proactively, or at least in the most proactive way possible. And so I think there's kind of buckets of a conversation that, depending upon what pulls one into it, is where we should pursue that.
Great. Thank you, Anne. All right, we have about a little under 15 minutes. We'll get as many questions as we can. The first one up I saw was Rebecca Dillingham. You are unmuted. I think. You have to unmute yourself. Or Emily, you have to unmute Rebecca. There we go. Introduce yourself.
Sure. Thank you so much for spending this time with us today, Congresswoman. I am the director of the University of Virginia's Center for Global Health, and I'm proud to see the diploma behind you. I have seen really firsthand how America's universities can play a vital role in combating diseases, both locally and globally, from Virginia to Haiti to South Africa and to Brazil. And also note that USAID partners regularly with our university and others, including with EBMS, to develop new products to help prevent HIV, which is a topic very close to my heart. So the question that I have for you is, why and how are our universities such valuable partners in the fight against some of the world's most dangerous diseases, and how can we do more?
Oh, good question.
So I'll start by saying thank you for all that you are doing. You gave a couple of good examples of what University of Virginia, for example, is doing, but I think where we could do more is by focusing on, and I'm sure if you gave me more time, I'd come up with a whole laundry list, but my immediate response is providing a little bit more global exposure at all levels, particularly with undergraduates, because I think that understanding the US role in the world is one that is more possible when you have the actual on the ground ability to understand differences that exist and but also the interrelated way that countries and communities work together. And so I think even just initially being part of creating an interest in the rest of the world, as many universities do through exchange programs and through concerted efforts, I think that's an important and initially very valuable element, which frankly we could be doing at high school and middle school levels as well. And in terms of on a broader scale, when it comes specifically to pandemic relief, I mean, I think continuing, frankly, to some degree, it's an element of funding. To some degree, it's a element of whether or not there are the grants funded for universities to apply for research in some of these more, what they seem potentially as more obscure international threats, be it a particular type of a disease or a particular type of a health-related or dietary illness. A commitment from the federal perspective, particularly with Congress, in recognizing the value through NIH funding and a commitment to research here at home, that universities and researchers have the opportunity to study some of the issues that may not be top of mind, but ultimately might pose major national security threats or priorities, or be a solution to a larger global challenge.
Maybe I'll take two that had their hands raised real quickly at the beginning. Rabbi Asher, I see yours, and Jeff Wasden. Why don't the two of you go one at a time? Rabbi Asher first, and then Jeff Wasden, and then back to the Congresswoman to do those two together. We'll see if we can have time for a few more.
So thank you very much.
Rabbi Asher. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your time. Thank you for your strong leadership and excellent representation here in the 7th District. So we know that our overseas connections are vital to our well-being, and that our partnerships, our strong alliances around the world, our friendships really help us as citizens feel safer and better about who we are and what we represent. So I know this firsthand when it comes to the state of Israel, where many members of my family live and where I've spent so much time to see their leadership, in large part due to America's help and assistance and guidance. They've really become beacons of democracy and freedom in that part of the world. So my question for you is, why is it, in your opinion, and how can we articulate it to others, that coordinating with overseas allies and multilateral organizations is critical for a pandemic when it comes to a global crisis or global health crisis. So what would you like us to know? What are you and your colleagues working on along these lines? And specifically to help those who are of the more vulnerable populations, and how does that affect our own citizens here in the U.S.?
Great. And Jeff Wasden?
Great to see you, Liz. And thank you, Congresswoman, for your incredible words that you shared today. I echo the rabbi's comments. Because of the work of USGLC and so many other incredible NGOs around the world, we've made incredible progress in defense development, diplomacy, the things that USGLC cares so much about. How do you see COVID-19 really threatening the incredible progress that we've made on combating so many other areas and diseases like polio, measles, AIDS, and other issues that we've been dealing with? We've made such great strides. How does this impact not only that fight, but others?
Thank you.
Two good questions.
Okay.
Please.
Well, and I'd like to note, Rabbi Asher was the aforementioned rabbi who I met that first time in a coffee shop. So it's lovely to come full circle and to hear your voice on this call. You know, I think there's, how do we get people to understand the value of these international relations? We have a dependency and a cooperative relationship with so many countries, and we have a dependency on relationships for information. So let me explain what I mean. So through our diplomatic relations, through our intelligence sharing, that is how we get information that is vital to our ability to understand conflicts that might be brewing, threats that might be challenging, on the ground uncertainty. And in fact, with COVID-19, there was initial reporting because we weren't getting good information from China. We weren't getting good information about the fact that there was potentially a pandemic or there was this unknown virus that seemed to be particularly contagious. And so we initially got reports of that through intelligence. And sometimes the intelligence comes from our people on the ground, and often it comes from partners who are sharing information with us. And so I think understanding the vital relationships that we have with our closest friends and allies, many European nations, Israel, as you mentioned, it's incredibly important that we recognize the value that these relationships have, not just for cultural ties and economic partnerships, but also because these are the partners who alert us to threats, and we are the partners who alert them to threats, and we coordinate on so many of these challenges. And I think being able to recognize that the United States of America is a strong and incredible country, but we can't go it alone. And when we demonstrate leadership on the global stage, part of that leadership is being a partner. Part of that leadership is going to our friends and allies with information and having them come to us with the same. And I think sometimes that gets missed because we can't be everywhere at all times. We can't know everything at once. And it is the relationships we have with our closest friends and allies throughout the world that allow us to make determinations that impact our own security. And I think the more we can talk about that, it's a little bit kind of disconnected down the road. But I think that it's a valuable element. And so, it's one that I talk about, but I think even just explaining, like, so much of the information that keeps us safe comes from our close friendships with other people. And then the other question, how does COVID-19 threaten the progress we've made in other places? This is the one that I find to be tremendously worrisome, because it isn't necessarily the virus COVID-19 that threatens our ability to fight AIDS or malaria or any other global health challenge. I think in part it's our reaction to COVID-19. I think, and this is my assessment, our slow reaction and the administration's slow reaction in how aggressively and how seriously we took the threat, I think it's hurt some of the credibility that we have on the world stage. And we weren't the only country to be slow to take it very seriously. There's some notable others within the community of Western countries that were a bit slow. But time and time again, demonstrating that we weren't necessarily taking it seriously, that we didn't think it was a complete threat, that we didn't pull together the same kind of force of strength that the United States typically demonstrates to deliver aid or to create whatever it is that we need to, pull ourselves up. I think that has harmed our place on the global stage as it relates to this, and that of course is that is not necessarily going to negatively impact the researchers on the ground. We still have American researchers who are working internationally, and their work, I think, is actually going to be foundational to us restoring, to some degree, the credibility that we have on the world stage, I think, into the future, wherever members of Congress advocating on behalf of the United States, and certainly, through the hearings that we have or the calls that we have with foreign diplomats here in the United States, wherever we can, impress upon other countries that yes, there's value in our work together, and yes, we are now responding or attempting to respond adequately. But I think the biggest challenge is that globally, we didn't demonstrate the same urgency that the United States generally demonstrates. And I think we have a lot of work to do in rebuilding our credibility in this space, at least from a government standpoint. And we'll have to lean heavily on our researchers and people out in the field to be the face of the United States in terms of the reassuring people that we are still a global leader and that we intend to be on issues such as global health priorities.
Congressman, before we have to wrap up, I want to be able to call on my colleague Elizabeth Hayskamp, who is the outreach director who helped put all this together. But I want to end on a note and give you a chance for the very last question, which is we've been talking about all the challenges, and they are extraordinary, and you've done a magnificent job shining a spotlight into so many of them on a wide scale. But one of the things I've noticed, and I'm sure you have noticed too, that in the midst of all these challenges, there's been wild inspiration among our fellow citizens, both in this country, in your district, and worldwide. And I wonder if you could just, really briefly, we only have 2 minutes to close, and I want Elizabeth to get the last word in. What inspiration, what story, where have you seen that spirit of America come through in the inspiration in your district or in the world in this very difficult time? Congresswoman.
Thank you for the opportunity to end on a high note. We actually have just started a program highlighting the heroes of the 7th District, people who have done really extraordinary things, because during all of this sadness and all of this challenge, I think we need some of these good news stories to understand what's happening. And I'll give a very simple one that I just experienced. I mentioned that I was at a food distribution event over the weekend. And in preparing and discussing with my team that I was going to be there, we became aware that there might be a need for masks. And so one of the women on my team connected with a group that's been sewing masks, and they said, could we help get masks to bring to this event, connect these 2 volunteer organizations with one another, that one's doing food, one's doing masks, because in some of our communities, particularly underserved communities, we think it's, my mother-in-law's a knitter and a quilt maker. So, it hits, they say you should wear masks, and all of a sudden we've got all these quilt fabric, fantastic masks that she just drops at the door. People are able to buy them, people are able to have bandanas, but in underserved communities, even the actual ability to cover your face as a basic priority and safe measure is hard. And so they said, could we maybe, the discussion was, okay, there's going to be 500 masks delivered for this. And in the end, it was more than 1,100 masks that they were able to bring. We brought these 2 groups together, and the group that makes the masks ended up giving 1,100 when the initial, request was, could we try and get 500? And you see, we have a woman who's a VCU professor, and I know about this story because one of the women who works in my office, her son was graduating this year. And of course, the excitement of that has been tamped down. And so this woman, this professor at VCU, got in her car with her husband and her son, who I think is 14, and drove to the homes of all of her students, Maryland, Northern Virginia, down to Roanoke. She took a road trip all day and went to all of their houses with the big sign clapping for them, you know, to give the affirmation that your success and your achievement is something that I'm taking the time to recognize. And I spoke to her on the phone the other day, and you know, it was really delightful to hear her talk about like what it was like on this incredible road trip, you know, up all across Virginia and into Maryland in order to honor the kids whose lives have been disrupted. And you know, and then it's the little things like my daughter's kindergarten, 3rd grade, and 6th grade, and so listening to my daughter's kindergarten teacher and my other daughter's 3rd grade teacher, you know, adapt to Zoom, where they're, you know, the kids are unmuting themselves and the teachers being that steady person. You know, and that's not to discuss the larger issue related to broadband connectivity, which is a major priority of mine. But, you know, in those delicate moments where here's one woman at home, you know, her kids are there, life is up, you know, up in the air, from normalcy is no longer here. And in that moment, like, she's that bit of normal for all of these kids, and making it fun and not scary and not, you know, not worrisome that this is how they have to have class. And so I think if you look for the little things where
those are beautiful.
Yeah, beauty, it's helpful.
Well, that is beautiful, fantastic. I am cheering for you and thanking you for all of those amazing comments. And to close out our program and to thank you, my colleague, Elizabeth Haskamp, who's our Northeast Regional Director. Elizabeth.
Hi, thank you, Liz, and thank you, Congresswoman Spanberger, for this engaging conversation during these critical times, and for your unwavering support for America's global leadership and, you know, ending us out on that hopeful note. I'm so appreciative of each of you who joined us today for this conversation, and to thank Representative Spanberger, including our wonderful Virginia Advisory Committee members, our Veterans for Smart Power, and our 2 partners for this event, Child Fund International and the University of Virginia Center for Global Health. Thanking your congressperson and sharing your position is critical to keeping U.S. leadership around the globe strong, so that we protect our economic interests, our national security priorities, and our humanitarian values. So when your congressperson speaks out or takes action on behalf of our development and diplomacy programs, please say thank you. They definitely don't hear it enough, and your voice continues to make a difference. Here at the USGLC, we do try to regularly update you on what's happening here in Virginia, around the country, and around the world. You all should have received a few updates over the past couple of weeks, and if you haven't, please follow up with me afterwards to make sure you're on our mailing list. And for up-to-the-minute information, please follow us on Twitter. Thank you all again for your support and voice during these difficult times. I enjoy hearing from you and look forward to continuing this conversation with each of you. Be well, stay safe, and have a great Monday. Thank you all for joining.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Congresswoman. Be safe. Have a great day. Thanks. Bye.